So,
I didn't get reading done.
in order to finish this book, we'll finish this book on Tuesday.
Or we could just
Today's Thursday.
the end of the book.
We're not finishing it because we don't like it. And we'll move the 2 stories on Tuesday for our last class meeting.
Well, what are we going to do on the last class? If we're missing something important.
I usually leave that last class not full because I usually have to move
For this very purpose?
for this very purpose.
Okay.
I've done this before.
Or every.
Don't worry, I'll send out an email. No one's even functioning right now.
I'm functioning.
Even Matt is like,
Okay.
I don't know what are you talking about.
You my Kai Blueberry.
Acai.
Acai.
Oh, hello.
They sell them at Costco in a pack that's like
Does it, Maddie?
this big.
Yeah,
Like,
you were not here.
I bought one and I brought it here with me and I just ran out yesterday.
How much was that?
It's like $13.
Buy everything in bulk.
This
It's
was
like 3
for-
or 4.
Yeah, no, it's super, it's so good for you, the berries.
All right, let's
But you
go.
finished that
Let's
one.
talk about, you haven't missed anything except lots of confusion. We're only.
That's all life is anymore.
3 minutes
so.
late. So let's discuss the geology of Hebrew as we work our way through this. And we're going to look at page 8. This is the bottom of page 8 here. I think this is a great bit, again, about trilobites. Despite that I did not like this book's focus on trilobites, as she told me during lunch. Luke, if you look at about 2/3 of the way down on page 8, you'll see a sentence that begins, "How strange." Middle of the.
Yeah, I
Go
got
ahead, would you read that for a bit? And you'll go into page 9, and then I'll pause you.
Okay, you go. How strange, I said to myself as I lay on the bench, that in Hebrew literature, and this includes the literature of the Hebrew Enlightenment, there isn't even a single trilobite.
I'm going to pause you there for a moment. Hebrew Enlightenment. What's the word for that?
Bible.
Haskalah.
I didn't even look that up. That was
I-
empty. That was in my brain.
That's awesome. Thank you, Maddie. That makes me feel good, I think. Okay, go ahead, Luke. Not as good as Hannah made me feel last time.
It wasn't you.
She complimented me
Oh.
because she wondered just what I'm thinking about in the middle of the day. Which I really,
Still haven't tweeted anything.
I've never tweeted anything.
It's a little disappointing.
That can be the last class when you craft your first.
Y'all followed him?
tweet. Yeah, I followed him.
Yeah,
That's his name.
Why do you have a Twitter?
Yeah,
I was going to use
Why
it to promote
don't
my
you have a
book, but
Twitch?
then I
That
realized
was
that
aggressive.
was-
That was.
Because I was not a Kardashian. If I had been a Kardashian, it would have been more.
Nothing.
Luke, would you continue?
Love to. What am I talking about?
No, say again, please.
What am I talking about?
Yeah. Keep going.
Pause, because there's a comma. You couldn't even find a saber-toothed tiger or a dinosaur or a mammoth in Hebrew literature, not even in the great works of Brenner or
Ginesen.
Gnesen. And not because they didn't know of their existence either. Indeed, Brenner, as is well known, worked for a time doing manual labor before World War I in an excavation site of a Russian delegation of fossil scholars in the Negev.
Negev.
Okay.
It's
thank you.
desert, yeah.
And was among those who unearthed a wall of ammonites. Those same beautiful spiral-shelled creatures that became extinct along with the dinosaurs 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous, yeah? Is that? Okay, Cretaceous period, and today bake in the desert sun at the Raymond crater.
That's right. Very good. So this is a desert in Israel, the Negev Desert. It's occupies most of the south of the country, and Brenner, at least according to this novel text, other fiction, worked on an excavation there, which I think is very interesting, and unearthed the wall of Ammonites. Now, I've been to this wall of Ammonites, and Ammonites,
Okay, these?
yeah, perfect. I was gonna draw it, but you're right. They're right here. That's an Ammonite. And you can see them on this wall that has been kind of collapsed, eroded partially. And you can see them in the Ramon crater in the Negev desert. I did not know that Brenner worked there, but I like this notion of Brenner finding these ammonites, finding these fossils, because what we see going on through the text is a kind of excavation of different layers of Hebrew literature. Starting with Brenner, Genesim is even earlier. I guess they overlap to some extent. And we've read Brenner, so we understand. We're like, aha, it's Brenner, the guy we read, and he worked on this thing. So we should have some sense of these, of this connection here to these fossilized images. Now these writers fossilized Brenner, Genesim. I mean, the only people who read Brenner today are writers and scholars, like yourselves. You read. No one's like, the new book by Brenner, I can't wait. It's not, it's not something people read. His Hebrew, first of all, is very, very difficult. It's archaic to a certain extent. So it's difficult. So there's a kind of excavation of the layers of the literature itself. And we see this over and over again as he brings up other writers. Now here's another example of this kind of geology, or maybe it's an archaeology of Jewish literature, Israeli culture, Jewish history, maybe. Take a look at 37. And this is about his grandfather. If you look second line down from 37, it says he wanted to toss. Go ahead, Sarah, do you see that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
He wanted to toss his last pack of cigarettes into the garbage when he went to work at the Khalid clinic, which was erected on the site of a Palestinian village whose inhabitants were expelled or fled in fear and were not allowed to return at the end of the War of Independence, and whose name we would conjure up each time one of us got the flu, and we would all troop out to the Palestinian village Khalid without ever suspecting that Khalid clinic was in fact the Palestinian village Khalid. Wanted to throw them away for good in order to show his good faith and be given medicine and get better, but he backed down from his decision and instead gave the pack to the head doctor at Khalid, a man who smoked cigarettes from morning to night and even blew the bitter smoke onto his many sick patients out of the belief that the smoke would disinfect them, and so exterminate the bacteria they were drenched in, and which was eating the better part of their bodies.
Right. And then later on, the doctor actually is a submarine mechanic.
Wait, is that one sentence?
That's one sentence, and that's why I didn't pause there, because I wanted to get a sense of how that sounds. It's one sentence. And it's interesting. Now look at how it's done. He wanted to toss his last pack of cigarettes into the garbage when he went to work at the Khalid clinic. And that whole bit in the middle is an aside. He said he wanted to toss the last pack, wanted to throw them away for good in order to show his faith. That whole bit in the center about Khalid and the history of Khalid is a kind of aside. And in order to understand that history, we have to kind of excavate the sentence. We have to go there and we have to dig through the sentence to get to this history. And what's this history? The history is about Israeli history or Jewish history, we can say. There's a village, a Palestinian village. The residents were expelled or kicked out. We don't know. Apparently the narrator doesn't know. Just like in what that we read, Hannah? The novel we read, in which Palestinians are expelled or flee from their village.
I don't know.
Pop it up.
I don't know.
Here a bit.
No one knows different now.
Just like in Hilda Pizza. So there we get another sense. This is a kind of element of Jewish Israeli history that is an open secret. It's there for everyone to see and yet hidden. That's why I call it an open secret. And these places exist and they have their names, but they've been wiped clean, some of them. And that's this Unplugged. So we have this whole aside. The Zvi Burstein, Hirsch, comes to Israel, starts smoking, wants to throw his cigarettes away as a way to work. But this whole interchange in the middle is this whole other story of Israeli history, in which some people who were living there were expelled or fled, so that people like Zvi could make a life for himself in this place. And it's just in the middle. It's just bracketed. And we have to, again, dig through it, tear it apart to see what's going on. I guess we could call this a palimpsest. Do you know that term? This is a really good word. Come on, do you know that term?
We talked about it in your class last quarter.
Wow. That must mean I repeat myself. That must mean I repeat myself. Thank you for laughing. A palimpsest was literally a piece of.
Wait, is there supposed to be that?
Yeah, there is.
Palimpsest. There was a palimpsest was literally a piece of parchment, so a kind of skin of an animal, and that was used. And because they were very valuable, sometimes they were reused. So someone would scratch with a stylus, with the sharp point for ink, into it and write something like, "Hi Grace, how are you?" And then would give her the letter, and she's like, "Wow, this piece of parchment is really valuable." She would get rid of the ink on it, take it away, and then she would write, "I'm fine, Max, how are you?" And you'd get it, but you could still sort of see underneath the scratchings of the original message. So a palimpsest is something with layers, in which one layer has been all but effaced, all but erased, but you can still make out traces of it. So there's a palimpsest here of history. There's Palestinian history, there's Jewish history, Polish history, European history, modern Middle Eastern history, and it's all in this one sentence. The sentence itself is kind of structured as a palimpsest. Go ahead, Matt.
Do you think he's using smoking as a metaphor? A haze, a cover-up, a cancer? It might really.
Watch this. Do you think he is?
Oh, do I
He's
think?
asking you.
No,
I want you to watch my teaching and try and actually.
no, I think it's probably stretching the point.
Could be. I mean, if you.
But I thought that other guy's son wasn't killed either.
Uh-huh.
So, I'm thinking outside the box here.
But we've already learned that.
Cigarette box.
Cigarette box. Yeah. No, I think that's fine. Look, I think that there's such a thing as creative misreadings. And to that extent, it's hard to say something is a misreading. It's a reading. It may not, on secondary reflection or further reflection, be upheld based on the evidence. But it doesn't mean it's not creative. And to the extent that I believe that literature is a machine to think with, if you're thinking with it, that's good, even if ultimately you change your mind. So I like this notion of creative misreadings.
I haven't changed my mind about the son.
I understand. Despite Adia's.
Despite the overplay.
Matt was so upset about this when we talked about the Yehoshua, and he's so insistent on his point, he was actually dead, that he went and looked up some secondary literature, which is not allowed. And he went to find an academic article, as I read by someone I know, just a few years ago, which I was not familiar with the article, and this Adia Mendelssohn Moaz, who's a scholar in Israel, she insisted that he was, of course, dead, and so Matt was large of him. He sent to me,
Kindly, yes. Yeah.
"This does not support my reading at all."
But I didn't bury the evidence.
You did not bury the evidence, right? That's right, because that's how we make new information.
Intellectual honesty, right?
That's intellectual honesty. Very good. And here's like this is, I don't know if this is the same concept of archaeology or this palimpsest of Israeli, Jewish, Arab history, but it's a connection of maybe that kind of universal collective we talked about last time. I didn't bring it up, and I think that's on 38. And I want to mention it because I think it's so interesting. This is about the magnetar, this dense star, and it explodes. If you look about halfway down the paragraph, the block paragraph says, an explosion or some other disturbance. You see that? Alice, can you read that for me?
Yeah.
Take it slow, please.
An explosion or some other disturbance in the star sent gamma rays in a 20,000 year journey of destruction. For 20,000 years, the rays paddled through the darkest of dark, without tiring, until they reached us on August 27, 1998, flooding us like a wave for 5 minutes, breaking every measuring device we've got. August 27, 1934 was my grandfather's first day at the Immigrant Center. And on that day was the magnetar's deadly rays. The magnetar's deadly rays were still quite far away. During the 30s, numerous Jews arrived from Europe, and there's no need to mention that they fled from Hitler and all of his jolly collaborators.
Fantastic. So now think about what happens here. I guess there's the magnetar, this universal, I mean literally in the universe, this stellar, interstellar explosion that travels vast distances for 20,000 years and arrives on the same day, not same year. His grandfather arrives in the immigration center in what was then Mandate, Palestine. And why did his grandfather arrive there? Because in the 30s, Jews were fleeing from Hitler and his jolly collaborators. So we tie together the collective history of the Jews and their forced migration, their statelessness, with the personal history of the narrator, who shares the same name as the author, and his grandfather, Tzvi, the individual, with the interstellar, the universal. And all that occurs, again, in a couple sentences. His ability, and I think it's a real tightrope, to connect these things in just a sentence or so is quite remarkable, even if you don't like the book, as Emma has told. Now, a couple other things here about this geology of Hebrew. Wow, I did a lot of work on this book. It's really interesting. Okay, we'll stop there for that present. We'll go now to the third thing, and that's extinction. Take a look at 9, which I think is, and I have more to do on. I'm just going to cross those off or add to it. Okay, I'll cross them. Take a look at 9. A little bit further down, where is it? Why didn't I note it?
What are you looking for?
Our existence. Sorry, it's actually on 10. If you look on 10, before the page break, beneath the italics, there's a sentence that begins, for a moment. Go ahead, Izzy. You see it, right?
Yeah. For a moment, I felt like a string being strummed by thousands of fingers, and I closed my eyes. Our existence on this planet hangs by a thread. Every tomato and every onion is such an enormous miracle you could collapse with awe in the vegetable market.
Right. That's just a great line. Like because he's part, and we use the term defamiliarization, correct?
Yeah.
We had that. And I mentioned to you that the purpose of art is to make the stone stony. Did I say that?
Yeah.
Everyone else says I said it first. Now, I trust in that. Rule of the majority.
That doesn't usually
Not
work.
always.
Never mind. So that this sense, it gives us a sense of the beauty of things that we see every day. This is a tomato, an onion. It's a miracle. You could collapse in awe at a vegetable market. Now, who's been to the fruit and vegetable market in Tel Aviv? You have? You have, Molly? What would happen if you collapsed in awe at the vegetable market? That's right, you'd be trampled to death. But never mind, because it's very crowded. But I like the image of this solitary person, like, just weeping. I think this is kind of like, it's like it's like dorm room philosophy, but it's actually really potent because it's artfully described. Go ahead, Sarah.
I just have a question, a little off topic, but not too much. Did Todd also translate this picture to what it says underneath it on page 11?
Yes, he did.
Okay. I just wanted.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's on topic. Now, we can see a few other things here, and this notion of this threat behind everything exists here. Our existence hangs by a thread. Hangs by a thread is kind of a cliched image. I understand that, but still, we need to get a sense of the frailty. We need to get a sense of the specialness of this existence, and he does that by having us collapse in awe with him in front of an onion. Take a look now at 33. Sorry, let's look at the bottom of 32 to top of 33. And it's talking about what they call, to some extent, in planetary science, the Goldilocks zone. Have you heard about this? You guys are clearly not watching enough Netflix documentaries about space. I don't know what you're doing.
It's pretty easy to figure that one out.
Right.
It's just right.
That's right. The Goldilocks zone is the area, distance from the sun, depending on the strength of the star, that it's not too hot to support life and not too cold to support life. It's just right. Thank you. It's my astrophysicist friend. So
Transported back to childhood.
that's the Goldilocks zone. So here he talks about the Goldilocks zone on 32. If you look at the bottom after the page break, there's a sentence begins, even the simplest acts. Just tell me if you see that. Just nod. Go ahead, Hannah.
Even the simplest acts, like showering, remind me that within the vast range of possible temperatures in the universe, from freezing to the very hot, the range of temperatures possible on the face of planet Earth is tiny, less than 40 degrees between the lowest and highest recorded temperatures in Tel Aviv. When a slight deviation in either direction would wipe out almost all life on the planet, and the writing of literature pretty much before anything else, I thought while soaping up.
Now look at how he takes us on this like interstellar journey while he's...
I mean, what do you think when you're in the shower? Like,
I'd let you know, but I don't tweet.
Oh.
I just think it would be so good if you can.
Okay, maybe I'll try.
Just like one.
I'll just tweet to you. All right, now, the second one. The second, keep going there, we're not done. On my bench.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
On my bench, the moon had already slipped behind a cloud and was now covered up by it. I tried to imagine writing these lines in a world where the temperature was a uniform 70 degrees Celsius, or even 100.
That's perfect. So we get this image, this background opportunity about how literature wiped out pretty much before everything else if we just weren't in the right spot. And this is a kind of I read some other sort of popular science things, and it is a recurrent topic in these books about how there must be other life out there in the universe, but also how remarkably rare it must be given the total number of stars, galaxies, and planets. Like even within that, and we're talking, as they say, billions and billions, but still, it's still exceedingly rare mathematically. And he seems to recognize and tries to bring it in. And if you look on 35, he continues this whole notion, 34 and 35, he gives this whole notion of our frailty. And he's talking about, at the very top, eradicating every bit of life in Tel Aviv, and the sun hasn't become a red giant. It's true that human beings must live their lives in this insane pollution, which will one day be the end of us all, or of our offspring, who are, for all intents and purposes, still us. But most human beings don't understand this, and routinely concoct the self-same poisons they'll hand down to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren to drink. And here's the money line. We were given a rare opportunity, and probably will blow it like idiots. So top 34, so he sees this. That's right. He sees this, he sees our frailty, he sees the danger, he sees the utmost
Peril.
peril, thank you, to our existence in each line. And if you then jump to 35, he talks about the moon and the moon's interactions with the earth and how it keeps us alive. And then you see a few lines up from the top of 35, more than a few, maybe 10, it says, without the moon. Let me know if you've got that, somebody. Go ahead, Allison.
Just
Yes.
read it. Without the moon, these pages would burn or freeze, just like the readers and the writer himself, I thought. And this thought caused me such unease that I started trembling there on the bench, like someone with a sudden fever. In my imagination, I saw these pages coming together into a book, and the book being published. But the next image was one of mass extinction. All the animals and plants on Earth, an event resembling any one of the at least 15 extinctions our planet has experienced. Extinctions no one seems to care about, aside from a few scientists.
Right, so we get a sense of again, what is just around the corner. Potential extinction. Constantly, he harps on this theme, I would say. And on 43, I won't bash this into the ground. I won't flog a dead horse, beat a dead horse. But I will say this one more, this is funny if you were here last night, beating a dead horse, but you missed it.
So homework, beat a dead horse.
Wait, you do 43.
43, above the page break, it says, a supernova would eradicate. Molly, do you see it? A supernova would eradicate on page 43?
The fourth line.
Fourth line down, thank you.
Yeah. A supernova would eradicate all life up to a distance of 30 light years around the exploding star. A long way indeed, but so is the distance that radiation can travel from the explosion. And it's not impossible that such radiation is making its way towards us at this very moment and will flood us with a blinding shower at noon tomorrow.
Right, so he suggests that we could all be wiped out tomorrow, that the cataclysm is always just on the horizon, which is another way of him expressing gratitude for the beauty that surrounds him. Those are two sides of the same coin for the narrator. That's, I guess I would say, about the notion of extinction. Is that the last thing? Yeah, that's the last thing I want to talk about. In the first section here, now let me go and point out a few other things here. So now I'm going to go. Now we're going to talk about the geology of Israel.
It got worse throughout because it's a depressing part.
Yeah, he's doing it on purpose.
Yep.
You know that they say that one of the ways to preserve mental health is to treat your job, what you must do, as a kind of game to have fun with, which must be
So that's fine.
super healthy. That's what I'm saying.
No, that's saying.
I used to do that in surgery. I used to do that in surgery, treat it as a game, it was a lot of fun. Make noises like this. It was so
Did you tell? Did you really?
Yeah,
Did you tell your patients?
they were asleep.
Did you like play tic-tac-toe on their stomachs and stuff?
Certain things I can't reveal.
Sign my name, HIPAA and OSHA. And all
Do you
that stuff.
know what his specialty was?
Yes, he's an OBGYN.
Wow, you just secretly confirmed every woman's fear.
Nobody go to the
Just
gynecologist.
like, you know, tomorrow we could all be dead.
That's right.
Unless it's an absolute need, just stay away.
That's absolutely right.
That's why, you know, men gynecologists are dinosaurs now. Get
Right,
the yeah.
because they're playing tic-tac-toe on people's abdomens.
Uteruses, yeah.
Yeah.
Can't believe I'm saying this.
We're all a little touchy. It's the end of the quarter.
It must be what's in for these things.
Tic-tac-toe.
Okay.
we're all friends.
Nobody heard
Before
that.
we're, what?
I can't handle this. Geology of Israel.
Geology is
I'm ready for the star to explode.
Let's talk about, let's talk about this. Let's talk about 67. And this is right after the page break. Let's read this. This is talking about the hotel. This is the skeleton. This is the dolphin. We're talking again, it's about excavation. It's about digging down. But here we get a more modern sense of history. And Emma, I'll let you read this at the top of 67.
The Park Hotel stands where that skeleton was found, though it went up in flames a few years after it was built. The hotel was renovated, and then many years later, in 2002, the Passover terrorist attack took place there, in which 30 people were murdered and more than 100 were injured.
Now look at this strange compression of space and time. We have one place, this Park Hotel, which is near where the ancient skeleton of this dolphin, it's a dolphin, right? I'm not making that up. Dolphin was found. So this is, again, I think about this, it's a skeleton, well, it's a fossilized skeleton. And the fossils are made from the compression, and they endure over time. So it's compression, space, and it's time, and it's near the location of the hotel. The hotel burned down, but then was rebuilt. So the hotel exists as a palimpsest of itself, in a way. And what happened there is moved into 2002 when there was a terrorist attack. There was like I said, Netanyahu is not really famous for anything except terrorist attacks, but this is a particularly, but they're all awful, but this is a bad one in particular, in which it was the Passover holiday, and it was mostly older people who were doing their Passover meal in a big room, and it was just, shot up. So he connects these two events. I mean, one is literally prehistoric, and one is just the other day in a geologic time sense, 2002, which to me makes seem a long time ago, but it's really not in the world. So again, we get that geology where he extracts this history, contemporary history, modern history from this. If you look at, the other thing I should say is that the family hotel is called what? Tel Aviv. Did I tell you where Tel Aviv comes from?
Yes.
That's right, it's very nice. Tel Aviv is the Hebrew name for the German novel. It's translated from German in 1902 into Hebrew. It was published in 1902, so it was almost the same time it was written, it was translated to Hebrew. And the name of the German novel is Altneuland.
I don't know what you're trying to say.
I believe we said that last time I said it. Altneuland. Altneuland!
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
See, the Germans, they understand when you yell. It's
She did get it as soon as you got angry.
right?
You just have to get angry.
New land.
Old New Land. That's exactly right. Thank you, Kat. Old New Land. Doesn't make any sense? Aha. I will explain it to you. Old New Land it's the old land, the ancient land of Palestine, but it's also the new land where the new Jewish state will be. And Herzl, Theodor, he wrote this science fiction utopia novel in 1902. So when it was translated to Hebrew, how are they going to say old new land in Hebrew? Well, they could have just said it the same way they did in German, but it didn't sound right. It didn't sound literary enough. So the translator, a guy named Sokolov, he translated it as Tel Aviv. Aviv means spring, like the springtime, which is a time of new bloom, new life. What does tel mean? Tel, did anyone here do archaeology? All of you? Excellent. So a tel, in archaeological terms, is a mound that is built up of the accretions of civilizations. So it's old, a tel, where an old civilization was, but it's also aviv, spring, a new place for life to bloom. So that was the artistic, the literary, the aesthetic translation of Altneuland by Herzl into Tel Aviv. So Israel's cultural capital, and its internationally recognized capital, is Tel Aviv. This is the only city in the world I'm aware of that is named after a book, a novel, a science fiction novel, the translation of a science fiction novel, which, if you think about it, is really weird. There's only one other city I can even think of named after a literary name. No, real place named after a fake place. It's really a character. It's in California.
That's
Tarzana. Tarzana, California. It's not far from LA, right? Inland Empire?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No one wants to go there.
Right. So Tarzana, California is named after, that's right, Tarzan. Because the man who wrote Tarzan, Edgar Rice Burroughs, owned a vast ranch there. That vast ranch became
I
Tarzana.
feel like that's such like a lame name.
Yeah,
Tarzan.
Wow, it's like Northern Malibu.
It's not my fault. I just, I'm just saying, that's what it's, so, but I don't know of any other place. That's the only place I could think of. As you can see, I thought about this.
Literary is Hershey, Pennsylvania, named after the.
Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Came first.
Okay, Milton S. Hershey was the man who created the chocolate, the Hershey chocolate. The town was called that after him, but it actually does not have, or used to not have, when I was growing up, I grew up about 20 minutes away. It isn't, that's fine, I didn't know that.
I was like, wow, you
chocolate.
just prepped for this question.
I was waiting my whole life for this question. It used to have a different name. There was no actual town called Hershey. It's not officially governmentally recognized. I don't know if it now is or not. This was, 30 years ago.
Just
but-
where the, like, the
Hershey.
factory.
That's right.
Yeah. Maybe not actually.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see if there are
I think
other
it is.
cities named after.
Hershey
Yeah,
is
that's
just
also good.
east of Pennsylvania state capital, Harrisburg.
There's a lot.
And population 14,000.
Okay, we don't. But anyway, there you go. So I'm now, okay. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that time and space are compressed and compacted and twisted and distorted in a way that is consistent with this sort of astronomical, interstellar, geologic theme that pervades the novel. And I can give you a few more examples. Take a look at 84. We'd like to some of these.
Could you say that one more time?
Yeah.
There's no way I can say that again. But
But I can start it for you, and then maybe you'll remember.
the novel is pervaded by a theme of this astronomical, interstellar, spatio-temporal, space-time concept. Okay? And it recurs over and over again. So one of the essences here is to move beyond, but not just the collective and the individual, but to move it beyond into the universal. Hebrew literature is traditionally read, received, and studied in a particularist framework. Particular, meaning about Jews and about Hebrew and about nationalism and about state building. If you look over this course, everything we've done except this fits into that framework. This novel is an attempt to write from the margins, not even from the margins, from something that's even absent, trilobites, from all of Hebrew literature and bring it into the mainstream. This is in this way, it's a subversive work, because although it deals with the national narrative in a sense of Jewish history, European Jewish history, Jewish Israeli history, Palestinian Israeli history, it deals with all that. And it deals with Hebrew literature, but it deals with it from a non-self-obsessive regard. It pushes its boundaries constantly outward to beyond Israel, beyond the Jews, beyond the state, beyond nation building, beyond even the Hebrew language. Because there is no Hebrew word for trilobite. There is no Hebrew word for Ammonite. Those are transliterated.
What is in the Hebrew, the original Hebrew?
Trilobite, trilobitim,
So just
and ammonitim.
the word.
That's right. It's just how it's written. Trilobitim, ammonitim, all this stuff is.
Now you know 2 Hebrew words.
Let's come up in conversation all the time.
And notice that he never, if I'm not mistaken, well, there's one say he quotes like a letter or something. But other than that, all the literature he quotes from is non-fiction. All literature he quotes from is written in English. And none of it's fiction. it pushes the very envelope of what Hebrew literature can contain, both in its sense of genre, as autofiction, which doesn't really exist in Israel until this, a novelist who writes a novel that is inconsistently accords with his real life existence. It's not memoir, and it's not fiction, it's both. It's autofiction, so genre, and in terms of what his subject matter is. This is a strange beast. It's as if it's a mutation. It's trying to create a new branch on the tree of life. That makes sense? Of Hebrew literature. So far as I know, no one's really followed him down this, with this text. It's a kind of anomaly, but a popular one. Now look at 84. This is about the meteor strike. And the meteor strike that hits Netanya is the meteor that impacts and snuffs out part of his family history, which is his uncle's life. And that is because of the War of 1973, which is called the Yom Kippur War, because it was launched by Syria and Jordan and Egypt on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. The idea was, in Judaism, Yom Kippur is the Day of Judgment. And so the idea from the Arab army side was to create a Day of Judgment for Israel, in which Israel would be destroyed. The Arabs invaded from the different fronts, and actually the Syrians pushed rather far in, as did the Egyptians, and there were very heavy casualties, the Israelis, but the Israelis succeeded in scrambling and repelling the invasion.
Wait, did they not do it just because they were like, oh, it's Yom Kippur, so they're not going to be ready?
That is exactly right. They did not think that they would be ready because it was Yom Kippur.
I thought you meant the only reason was because they were like Day of Judgment.
No, but that was another reason. They also said they wouldn't be ready. However, as a curiosity of Jewish Israeli culture is that Yom Kippur, people tend to stay around with their families even if they're not religious. So in fact, it was rather easy to mobilize the military to defend Israel. Whereas if they had done it on a different holiday when everyone's going around, tramping around in national parks and picnicking and having bonfires and getting drunk, it would have been much more difficult. It was actually it was a bad decision to do it on that day, obviously, because the Israelis succeeded in repelling that invasion. But so it has this Day of Judgment, there's this metaphysical, spiritual element to it in Jewish Israeli culture. And it was a kind of miraculous defense. The prime minister at the time was Golda Meir, who, by the way, lived in, she's not from Denver, she's from Milwaukee, but she lived in Denver. You what?
She's from Milwaukee.
She's from Milwaukee, that's correct. Where you're from?
Also, the trilobite is the Wisconsin state fossil.
The what?
The trilobite is the Wisconsin state fossil.
Did you know that? Just in general?
There's a state fossil?
I'm sure Colorado does, we have a lot of dinosaurs.
The Stegosaurus, how stupid is that? Oh my god. No.
So great.
That makes me so angry. It's a dinosaur. Well, I mean, they're all dinosaurs, I guess.
What's wrong with the Stegosaurus?
So they have the big like fins on their back.
Literally, any
We have state everything.
any other dinosaur is cooler than the Stegosaurus.
Do we?
Yeah.
Just coming back from when you were like 4 years old. And
I had the Stegosaurus and everybody else had T-Rex.
Thank you for that bit of information. I'm impressed that you knew that.
Inside a riot.
I don't know why.
I actually learned that at my
One more
Jewish
thing
basic.
to add to the
Really?
list already.
Okay, well, there you go. Now, let's read from the top of 85, and I will let our friend Maggie read. A meteor struck Netanya at the top of 85, first line.
A meteor struck Netanya, but no one except me. My grandfather came here and thus survived the Holocaust that fell upon his family about 5 or 6 years later. But the force of his arrival also gave birth to his son, Shalom, who was killed in the Golan Heights at the age of 21 during his pre-release vacation. He was the youngest son. His 2 older brothers remained, one of whom was my father. My grandfather entered his ice age in October 1973. My grandfather's ice age took the appearance of diabetes and heavy smoking. What is called the Pleistocene began 2.5 million years ago and lasted until just around 12,000 years ago. This was the last severe ice age, and my grandfather entered his Pleistocene then, which felt to him as if it lasted just as long as the other one, and only came to an end with his death.
Right, thank you very much. So here again, we have this individual, Zvi Burstein, Shalom Burstein. The guy's uncle dies. The only person who pays attention to the meteor, who only imagines it as a meteor, is Dror, the narrator. That's why he says meteor. He sees this as some kind of epic event, this stellar event, and is wiped out in this, I think it's a tank battle. His grandfather enters an ice age, a kind of emotional ice age, a kind of frozenness and inability to move on, a paralysis, you might say, which is, I guess, a good metaphor there. And so we relate the individual to the collective to the universal, as well as having a geology of Israeli history, the Yom Kippur War, and Jewish history. His father is a Holocaust survivor, and those who didn't come having been exterminated by a different comet or meteor, different body. And 86, he continues with this. I won't bring that up too much, but I just wanted to let you know there. And then,
bless you.
Bless you. There's a great
Bless you.
geology of Israel or geology of Jewish history on 93, which I do think is worth looking at for a bit. Where it's if I'm remembering, it's the grandmother's friend tells a story about looking for her daughter who she left at an orphanage under Stalinist Russia. Right? And she goes back to find her, and the daughter is gone. And she never reunites. She's lost her child, which is, maybe the worst thing I can think of. That's the story he remembers, and if you look on 93 before the page break, take a look at where it says, I don't know much more about my grandmother, my mother's side. Do you see that above the page break? Kat, do you see it?
Yeah.
Could you read for a while? It's really to the page break, so just read it slowly so we get a good sense of this slow unraveling. Thank you.
I don't know much more about my grandmother from my mother's side, but what I do know well is that my passion for baked goods, warm bread, rolls, fresh cakes, and pastry pies, and especially cheese muffins, I got from her, who after years of hunger and exile in Russia immigrated to Ramla and lived in abandoned property with her family, and worked in Ramla in a bakery, and her daughters, my mother, and her sister helped her with the kneading and mainly with cleaning up the sticky dough that hardened on the stainless steel surfaces.
All right, I'll pause you there. So he says a little bit of his personal history, what he likes to eat, etc. And then he says she immigrated to Israel from Russia to a town called Ramla. Ramla is a historically Arab town. It's still very much mixed Arab, Israeli, Jewish Israeli. And she lived in, quote unquote, abandoned property. What do you think, Allison? She quickly looks away. What do you think abandoned property refers to?
Really? Or?
Yeah, really. I mean, take a guess. Think about history now. What could this abandoned property in Ramla be? It's a tough question. There actually is an answer.
There is an answer.
There is an answer. It's not like super interpretive, but I just wanted to, and I'm mean. I'm asking you, but.
I don't know. I just think of abandoned property. I don't know. I guess.
Yes. It's a home that's abandoned property. That's, I should make it clear. It's a residence.
So somebody's house.
Mm-hmm. But it's been abandoned.
So am I supposed to know whose house it is?
That's the question. You think you got it, Sarah?
Is it Jews that were taken into the Holocaust?
No, because Ramla is in Israel.
Oh.
I see what you're saying, yes. Emma?
It's the opposite. It's the Arabs, were probably driven out of the town.
Or who fled.
For whatever.
So this is a coded message, right? And I was wondering, it's a mean question to ask Allison, but it's a coded message. And the question is, do you have the context to understand it? I think you sort of do, but you have to think about it. it helps to know that Ramla is an Arab town originally, or it was an Arab Jewish town there. So, but then you know, and you can see, aha, so this is a coded message to be fleeing or being driven out. So this is about the immigration of the grandmother and her statelessness and dispossession, and someone else's statelessness and dispossession. There's a subtle link that goes in here, all right? Now I want you to keep going, Kat. Thus
my mother and her sister went through their childhood scraping dough, and the sole compensation was the warm bakery, the chalas and the breads, which they ate with no restrictions. Kneaded and ate, baked and kneaded, and pinched and sliced. And me too, just like them. I knead and bake. There's always bread in my oven. And sometimes I look at it, at the bread, and tremble.
Wow, I kind of get chills. And it's not just because I'm fighting. I think that line is amazing. We get this whole story about the bread and what it means, and this connection to Israeli history, to Jewish history, to Palestinian history, all together, and how they baked, and how they were hungry, and how it was their compensation, the warmth. And then I look at it, at the bread, and tremble. He sees it in a new way. This is defamiliarized for him. Or it's because it holds within all this weight of history. By the way, it's challah. Challah. Like challah French toast? Have you had challah French toast, Sarah? No? Kat?
It's so good.
Kat, will you take her for some challah French toast?
Yeah.
We work together, you know her, right?
He just quit.
Oh, yeah.
For our last class. Wait, I have the best Harvard French toast.
Somehow it doesn't surprise me.
My mom got it from her mom, which is so Amish country. Do they have really good bread in Amish country.
They make really good roofs.
My grandma.
And electric fireplaces, even though they can't use them because they're electric.
Anyway, okay, so challah.
They build nice
actually-
cabins too.
Let me, by the way, ruin some conceptions that many of our Jewish students have. Challah is basically Polish Easter bread. So Poles who are Catholic make an Easter bread that is almost exactly the same as challah, but often challah is not made with milk or butter, because Jews cannot eat meat and milk at the same meal. No pepperoni pizza. No cheeseburgers. So challah, traditional challah is often made without milk and butter. But other than that, it's the same as Polish Easter bread. So it's really not actually Jewish. Go ahead.
It's funny because one of my best friends is from Poland, and they invited me to their house for Easter, and she made that, and she told me to make challah for them, and I did, and she was like, I can totally taste the difference, like this is horrible, and I was like, it's the exact same thing, like I was the only person who could not taste the difference, and so
Between the
Polish people can taste the difference, but
Yeah.
Jews cannot.
There you go.
Just so you know.
So,
Experiment tested.
so you could go.
Yeah.
You could go to pretty much any, like Whole Foods sells challah.
So does King's
Yeah, but
Cross.
making it by hand.
Trader
is
Joe's
like
sells
5%
challah?
If you make it, it's just better.
Okay, I've never made challah, but I encourage you to bring some.
You can taste the love.
I encourage you. Let us taste it. Now, let's take a look at poets and poetry for a moment.
Let's look at what?
Wait, I have a quick clarifying question.
Please.
I'm having a hard time recognizing the difference between the geology of Israel and the geology of Hebrew. Or I guess I had a hard time understanding what the geology of Hebrew was. The geology, okay.
You can show them this.
And geology or
Geology. Geology. The idea is this excavation, this accretion,
I was
this
getting more of this space.
sedimentation, right?
Okay.
That's the kind of metaphor I'd like to get
Alright,
across.
got it.
All right, now let's take a look at poets and poetry, because here there's a lot of things, but I don't want to do everything. But I don't know what I've noted here, but I want. Oh yeah, here. Let's take a look at This is bizarre, but I want to point it out, and it's on 99. Very long. He is seeing something with his own eyes. Sarah, do you see that there it says, "With my own ears, I heard the poets, the festival poets"?
Me or?
Because, yeah,
Sarah?
Sarah.
Okay.
You, Sarah Stanhauser.
That's
Because
not my last name.
What's your last name?
Spanbauer.
Spanbauer.
That was way off.
It was still
there
German.
were syllables in there. It was constructed of letters.
It's possible that there's someone else who writes to me with that name on email. I don't know.
Maybe.
So, if you would, please, read that bit, because Dror, the real author, is a poet, and apparently the narrator Dror is also a poet.
With my own ears? With my own ears, I heard the poets at the Festival of Poets pass a platter of spicy beef sausages, one to another, and light imported cigarettes for each other. The cattle were imprisoned, the cattle were slaughtered, the cattle were sliced up and frozen, the cattle were placed on the table of the 3 senior poets, one of whom had won the Bialik Prize, and so in a certain sense were placed on the table of Hebrew poetry as well, where it met with the poet's sharp glimmering teeth and teeth of poetry. I stared at them and thought that, to tell the truth, I'm not interested in reading the rhymes of meat-eating poets. I'm not interested in watching the comedies of meat-eating playwrights, which are always monstrous comedies. And I am not interested in the prose of meat-eaters, which is always the cruel prose of slaughterers who pretend they're knitting lace at dusk to the strains of a harp.
Wow. So this is a kind of manifesto of vegetarianism. The actual author, Dror, has written a book about veganism, and he's a very big believer in animal rights issues. I think I mentioned that veganism is I think Tel Aviv is the #1 state in the world for vegans. So it's a very big movement there. I feel like somehow it's a kind of, my read is it's a suppressed or displacement of guilt and hopelessness. They can't do anything for the Palestinians, so the lefties become vegans in order to
But I feel like
expiate their sense of guilt.
Mediterranean food is also really easy to be vegan. Like, it's much easier than like living here.
It's true, but
Is that because
there's a
of that
lot of really,
guilt thing?
I would say that eggs, or like in America, I have a few eggs a week. In Israel, I have like 8 eggs a day. It's like just a thing. Like everyone's eating eggs all the time, and cheese. Yeah, eggs, cheese, and
I'm so hungry right now. I was looking at challah bread. And
Yeah.
that's one of my goals. But this sense here of the poets and the meat eating, and this disgust he has with the poets, a kind of bloodthirstiness, this image of poetry as itself being, what does he say, sharp, glimmering, as a kind of the teeth of poetry, some kind of like almost barbarism here is, I think, very interesting. I don't know what to make of it. I pointed out, we can make it what we will. But now let's look at this bit on 101, where his grandfather, named Tzvi Burstein, who is the name of a Yiddish poet named Tzvi Burstein, goes to visit Ori Tzvi Greenberg, which I have to say, this whole section is, to me, very funny. When I read it in Hebrew, I laughed. When I'm reading it now in English, I'm not finding it as funny. I don't know if it's the translation or it's just that I was in a different sense of mind when I read it originally.
It's God's fault.
I would like to blame him. So he goes to Ori Tzvi Greenberg. Now, Ori Tzvi Greenberg is one of the most important Israeli Hebrew poets ever. And he started out as a Yiddish writer, and if you take my class on images of Jesus and Jewish literature, you will read him again because he's famous for having written poems in the shape of a cross in Yiddish. He switched to Hebrew when he moved to Palestine in the 20s and became an extreme right-wing nationalist. He is perhaps the most right-wing of any canonical Israeli author. So I said all the authors reading are pretty much lefties, and that's just the case that most of Israeli literature is written by leftists, or at least people who would identify with the left, so kind of liberal left, perhaps, but not a radical or super progressive left, but a liberal left. But Horace Greenberg is radical right. And even despite his politics, he still considered great, and even left-wingers read him.
Just a side note, I mean, how many Hebrew poets are there really? Like very few, right?
There's a lot. I mean,
really?
in Israel, there's a lot. Poetry sells a lot in Israel. There's a lot. Poetry's a big thing in Israel. Much bigger than it is here. Here, you're like, poet, whatever, that's harmless.
Well,
in Israel, they can like make a wave, send a shockwave. And there's another reason why, is that in Israel, the role of the writer is the role of a secular prophet.
Okay.
Because it's a kind of inheriting of the mantle of prophecy from the ancient biblical world in which the prophets, they were raged, they were prophets of comfort. That's the kind of the way we describe it. They gave, they rebuked the people, they comforted the people after national distress, things like that, and they gave a horrible future if people didn't behave properly. And so the Hebrew writers, Israeli writers, have taken on that role. So I just read an article this morning in the Israeli paper about Amos Oz and his role as a self-proclaimed traitor, which we read about in Panther in the Basement, and how he's not really a traitor and all this other stuff, and talks about the role of the author, the poet, the novelist, as seer, as prophet. So that's part of the reason. And Horace Greenberg, he intentionally played up that role.
Okay.
His Hebrew is a kind of prophetic Hebrew. And he wrote a volume, and it's mentioned here, The Streets of the River, which is the great work of Holocaust poetry, which is not, for the most part, except for scattered poems, been translated into English. Very, very difficult Hebrew. He uses a whole web of symbols and repetitions in his poetry that are very difficult to make sense of. And so when Zvi Burstein goes to meet him, if you look at the top of 102, this is like 100, 101, 102, it says, Greenberg filled my grandfather's pipe before he filled his own, and then offered my grandfather the large metal lighter he still kept from the days of his service in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I, etc., etc., etc. If you look at the bottom of 102, there's this great misunderstanding. Greenberg didn't understand why the Yiddish poet Zvi Burstein was claiming he is not a Yiddish poet, but he kept quiet. They sat and smoked for a long time, and then Greenberg said to him, in truth, I understand. I too never wrote Yiddish poetry. Yiddish poetry is impossible to write, because it's impossible to speak in Yiddish any longer. Yes. How can we speak in a non-existent language? Greenberg asked my grandfather, and tapped his fingernail twice across the cross engraved on the metal lighter. How can we speak in burned letters? Because of the destruction, and because he gave up Yiddish when diaspora Judaism he felt had no future. They conversed, of course, in Yiddish, which is, I think, a kind of funny, ironic aside. Of course, they would have spoken in Yiddish. And then this continues on with this confusion and inability to really understand one another and what they're up for. But the reason the grandfather Zvi goes to Greenberg, is after he finds out the horrors of what occurred to his family in the Holocaust, their death. Because Greenberg was the great, wrote the great dirges. You know what I mean by dirge? Like a funeral song is a dirge, D-A-R-G-E, for the victims of the Holocaust, even though he himself was in Palestine at the time, didn't witness it. Because his family was wiped out, his Yiddish culture was wiped out. And so that's why he comes to be this writer. So I gave you this poem here. I gave you two poems by Greenberg. So I want to take a look at them because I think they're powerful. You don't have one? Does everyone have one now? Goldberg? We'll get there. Goldberg, Greenberg, Iceberg.
Lettuce.
And I thought there were 2 seconds.
Two, yeah, did you not?
I think I might have played.
This is the Greenberg.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so you see where it says, by the waters of the Sava? Yeah. Did someone do good? Max, can you read poetry well? I'll take that as a yes.
That's not a yes. I'll
Okay,
try.
so when you read poetry, you always read the title first. You stop at punctuation, but you do not stop at line breaks. If you stop at line breaks, it will not make sense. Typically. Okay? Remember that, Luke?
Yeah, no, I know.
You know.
I'm a bad English major, so I definitely know how to not read poetry.
Go ahead, Max.
By the waters of the south. Brother soldiers, with them in battle I reached the waters of the south. They fell, beat up in barbed wire, belonged only the thin wail, their life's essence expiring. Then they died very young. I stood alone like the last human being fighting. And I saw my growth until they came to their death and peace. I saw the moon, alive, scratching itself face on the blunted, hog-nailed souls of overturned soldiers. This terrible radiance on the nails of the dead, and the kick and sky, electrified my life with deadly shining terrors. The divine in the mystery of fear, I visioned Atlantis downfall with eyes of flesh. As the last one who weeps, there I wept mightily. In my life, I shall never weep again as I wept by the waters of the south.
This is a poem he wrote not about the Holocaust, but this is about his service, which is recalled here in the Austro-Hungarian army. This was a battle of the Sava, and this is what he witnessed. And it's absolutely, I think, stunning imagery. I'll read it to you in Hebrew just so you hear it, because you have to hear it in the original. Did I tell you about poetry? Will you that quote about reading poetry in translation? Yeah?
Yeah, like reading it or
Kissing a woman through a veil?
Yeah.
Good for you. How do you remember that, right? What?
You can read first.
So, for those who don't remember, unlike Hannah, Bialik said, the poet who is mentioned in this text, the national poet, reading poetry in translation is like kissing a woman through a veil. So, sort of there, but sort of not there. And then Yehuda Amichai said, who's a modern poet, died a few years ago, 15 years ago. He said, on the other hand, kissing a woman through a veil is not so bad. Like, that's the only way you're going to kiss her. You got to get it. So we read it in Hebrew, in English. Now I'll read it to you just so you hear the sound, the musicality of it, or its harshness, perhaps. Ad mimei hasave. Achim chayalim itam higati b'krav ad mimei hasava. והם נפלו ברגליהם למעלה אל סבכות הברזל, ויערך רק דק ילל תמצית חייהם הגבה. הם מתו, אפלים מאוד אז. אחד עמדתי כאחרון מגזע האדם הלוחם בעולם, וראיתי את החי הגדלים ברגליים למעלה, עד אשר יגיעו במותם לבעוט בשמיים. ואת הירח ראיתי מחכך כחי את פניו הכסופים במסמרים השחוקים על סוליות חיילים הפוכים. והזוהר הנורא הזה על מסמרים האלה בנעלי מתים הבועטים שחקים, חשמל את חיי ואימה זורחת עד מוות. אלוהות בסוד פחד חזיתי ומפל האדם בעיני הבשר. ואנוכי בכיתי אזי שם כאחרון הבוכים ולא אברח עוד בחיי כבכייה ההיא שבכיתי על מימי הסבא. It's very dramatic. It's a very dramatic poem. And the Hebrew is actually really hard. So if you gave this to a native Hebrew speaker, they'd be like, what? It's the syntax, the language, the symbolism, the delving into rabbinic language, the metaphysical elements here, like the divine mystery, like who knows what he's talking about. But some of it is very clear, very sharp. And that's actually, the more you read him, the more you see these recurrent symbols and can kind of pull it apart, decipher it. Now let's look at this other text. This is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, "You are not likened to dogs among the Gentiles," from Streets of the River, from the Holocaust poem. And this one is the most angry poem, one of the most angry poems I know.
Sorry, who wrote this?
This is Greenberg.
Still, okay.
This is the guy who he's meeting.
Okay,
The real poet. Yeah, sorry. Sorry.
Oh, I had a question on this.
Yes, sorry.
Why were those certain words why do they have asterisks?
In the text, there's some attempt to explain what he means there with those asterisks. It's a translation, so the translator has like these kind of footnotes in it.
Okay.
But I didn't think they were very good or useful, so I didn't include them. Does someone want to read "We were not likened to dogs among the Gentiles"? You want to do it, Annalisa? Okay. With gusto, if you would, and slow, gusto. With anger, fierce ferocity.
It's a lot of things.
Ferocity, yeah.
We were not likened to dogs among the Gentiles. They pity a dog, caress, even kiss him with the Gentile mouth. For like a puppy fondled at home, they pamper it, delighted in always. And when this dog dies, how very much the Gentiles mourn him. We were not led like sheep to the slaughter in the boxcars, for like leprous sheep they led us to extinction. For all the beautiful landscapes of Europe, the Gentiles did not handle their sheep as they handled our bodies. Before slaughter, they did not pull out the teeth of their sheep. They did not strip the wool from their bodies as they did to us. They did not push the sheep into the fire to make ash the living, and to scatter the ashes over streams and sewers. Are there other analogies to this, or disaster that came to us at their hands? There are no other analogies. All words are shades of shadow. Therein lies the horrifying phrase. No other analogies. For every cruel torture that man may yet to do man in a Gentile country, he who comes to compare will state he was tortured like a Jew. Every fright, every terror, every loneliness, every chagrin, every murmuring, weeping in the world. He who compares will say this analogy is of the Jewish kind. There is no recompense. There is no recompense for our disaster, for its circumference is the world. The whole culture of the Gentile kingdoms to its peak throughout our blood, and all its conscience through our weeping.
Right. So you can sort of see in the English this kind of prophetic rage that goes on here under the surface. I'll give it a sense. I feel like it's important to read the Hebrew. It's not just like I want to read the Hebrew, but I feel like it's good to hear. לא נדמנו לכלבים. לא נדמנו לכלבים בגויים, כי הן כלב אצלם ירוחם. ילוטף יש גם שינושק מפי גוי, כי חבלד חמוד בביתו יפנקהו ושש בו תמיד. ובמות כלב זה, מה מאוד יאבל עליו גוי? לא הובלנו כצאן לטבחה בקרונות רכבות, כי כצאן מצרורה. הובילונו למור חליה, דרך כל הנופים היפים מאירופה. לא כרצונם עשו הגויים בגופנו. בטרם שחיטה לא עקרו את שיני הצאן. לא פשטו מגופם את צמרם כאשר לנו עשו. לא דחפו את הצאן אל האש לעשות אפר מן החי, ולזרות את האפר אל פני נחלים וביבים. היש משלים עוד לזה אסוננו שבא לן מידם? אין עוד משלים, כל המילים צאלי צללים, ובזה הביטוי המחריד אין עוד משלים. כל עינוי אכזר שיעשה בן אדם בארץ גויית לאדם ידמהו הבא להמשיל, הוא אונק יהודי, כל מגור, כל זוועה, כל בדידות, כל עגמה, כל בחייה, הומייה בעולם יאמר הממשיל, זה משל מן המין היהודי. אין שילם לאסוננו כי מידת היקפו הוא לעולם, הוא עולם. כל תרבות מלכויות הגויים עד שיאה בדמנו וכל מצפונה בבכיינו.
It seems to flow a lot better.
It does, actually. There's a kind of movement, a kind of meter in Hebrew that doesn't come across in the English. This is not a great translation because there are no great translations of Greenberg. He's too darn hard. No one's done it yet. Honestly, they've been trying. They just can't seem to get it. Go ahead, sir.
I was at that thing on Sunday, the performance.
Yes.
And this lady came up to me afterward, and she was at least 50 something. And she started talking to me. She was like, "Thank you so much for coming." And I was like, "Well, yeah, I'm glad I did." And I thought she was from somewhere from here. And she goes, "Oh, you're from this school, right?" And I was like, "No, I go to DU." And she was like, "Oh." And then she spent the next 10 minutes wouldn't let me leave, talking about how Jews need
Jews should not be killed. And it kind of reminded me of this, where he's like, this is always what you're gonna think of Jews. And she was like, Jews should not be killed. And I was like, well,
Seems like something we can all agree on.
I was like, I agree with you. And she goes, well, are you sure? And I was like, yeah. And she was getting so mad at me. And I was like, yeah, I agree. Like, everything that happened is bad. And she goes, we have time, or we've needed time to like accept everything that's happened. And I was like, I agree. And she like kept yelling at me. And I was like, I don't know what you want from me, random person. Jews should not be killed. I don't.
Sarah, you may have come upon a crazy person.
And then she was also that lady, because she was sitting near me and my boyfriend, and like every time someone asked a question, she'd be like, yes, that's a good question, like straight out loud. And I was like, who are you?
There are also crazy people who come to good events, yeah. So
I was like, oh.
Don't take it personally. These are not.
But it, like, I don't know, it kind of reminded me of this, where he's like, this analogy of the Jewish kind, and then, the lady literally spent the whole time, she was like, Jews should not be killed. And he's like, well, obviously.
I agree, yeah. But you get sometimes these people.
I'm just trying to leave.
Cash.
I was just wondering if we did performance on Sunday, we were supposed to email you.
Yeah, just email me so I record it, okay?
Okay.
I wasn't there, so I need to know.
You have a lady trying
I was in a movie. I was in an Israeli film at the Denver Film Festival.
That's all movie.
It was excellent. It was called A Week in a Day. It was about, it was a great movie.
Was it about a week and a day?
It was about, just one film. It was about a guy, it's an Israeli movie, just made, it was very funny, also very sad, but a guy, his son dies, and after the mourning period, which is a week long, the next day, he tries to like get his life back in order, but ends up like still in grief and uses his dead son's medical marijuana to get really, really, really high with his neighbors who he's feuding with son, who used to be a friend of his son's, and it's a bittersweet, but it's good, it's really good.
The performance was a lot better than I thought it was gonna be.
I'm glad.
And like, yeah, because I thought it was gonna be some like lady just like playing the piano the whole time.
But it was more of a storytelling.
She told like the whole story of her life, and then she even answered questions as her, and then talked about how like she found out all this information, like how she went on her journey and the people she met and what they told her, and it was really cool. She's a cute little old lady. And then I found out that she's only like 52.
Really? I'm glad that you.
She looked like she was like 85.
Well, she was trying to train 99.
That's true.
So.
That's true. But even in like the pamphlet, I don't know.
All right, let's take a look at the other. So there's another thing here. He also mentions this poet Leah Goldberg, and this is the bottom of 103. He mentions her. He mentions her a few times throughout the text. If you look at 106. He mentions Leah Goldberg, and there's an effort here, and this is a geology, a genealogy, an archaeology of Hebrew literature, an attempt to claim these great writers, Brenner and Agnon, who we've read, and Goldberg and Greenberg, and Alterman as well, but I didn't bring you as like his forebears. And he says, this is a kind of like mystification probably of real life. That he leaves one of Leah Goldberg's volumes on Greenberg's desk, because Leah Goldberg was one of his grandmother's close friends and a regular guest, and there's a photograph of her on the balcony, and Alterman and the two of them and Agnon were there at his bris, which is his circumcision, at the narrator's circumcision. So he claims that these three greats, Alterman or Goldberg and Agnon, were all at his circumcision. Now, 1970 was when Agnon died, so I find it highly unlikely, but possible. In real life, his bris. They stood as my godfather in the year 1970, a ceremony with which Shai Agnon was also present. A short time before the death of all three. Goldberg also died then, that's right. I forgot about that. So Leah Goldberg, and this is why I never met her. She obviously died the year I was born, in 1970, so I never met her. But she was a great poet and translator, children's books, drama, one novel I think, some short stories and poems. And she was also the founder of the Department of Comparative Literature at Hebrew University, where I studied. And she was very good friends with a very good friend of mine, who was my professor. So I like this personal connection that I feel like I have with this woman who I never met. Leah Goldberg. And so I will also claim this genealogy that the narrator claims, even though it's probably not true for either of us. And there's a really lovely poem here that does connect to the notion of history here.
Can I have that one too?
Yeah, me too.
I like
You didn't
really
get the Leah
this
Goldberg
somehow.
poem? Does everyone have this one? I want to read Tel Aviv, 1935. Luke, would you read that?
Sarah needs the other one.
Good.
I know, I'm just, okay, so it's fine.
You have it, Luke?
Yes.
Please.
Tel Aviv, 1935. The roof poles in those days were like the masts of Columbus, every crow on their pinnacles announcing new shores. Along the streets strolled knapsacks, and the words of a foreign country plunged into Khamsin, days like the cold light of the night. How could the small air support so many recollections of childhood and of withered loves and rooms grown empty elsewhere? Like blackening snaps in a camera, their images reversed. White winter nights across the sea and rainy nights of summer, capitals dark at dawn. Behind you, foreign footsteps drummed the marching songs of an army, and on the sea, you thought you saw the church of your own town.
Now, let's take a look at this. This is Tel Aviv, 1935. Leah Goldberg is there. Leah Goldberg comes from Eastern Europe, from White Russia, I believe, and she's there at the beginnings of this era of building a modern Hebrew literature in this modern Hebrew state. Tel Aviv is a young city. Israel's not yet a nation state. It's a young society. And as we already know from our discussions in class, from the historical context, and as we know from this text, in the 30s is when people are flooding in from Europe as the Reich gains power, as the totalitarianism expands and anti-Jewish agenda expands across Europe. More and more Jews come to what was then Mandate Palestine. So if you see that first stanza, the roof poles in those days were like the massive Columbus, every crow on their pinnacles announcing new shores. So there's a sense of a kind of floating city. There's a sense of discovery and of newness here, which I think gets to the heart of the new Hebrew culture. And in this new city, I should also say that one of the nicknames for Tel Aviv is the White City. It's called the White City because many of the old buildings, not all the old buildings, were white stucco. They were built like kind of like that wall there, white stucco, kind of nooks and crannies. And they were, which by the way, stucco is a terrible material to build in salt air on the sea, but nonetheless, that's what they did. And they were coming, many of the architects were German trained or European trained who came to build these buildings, and they brought with them what's called the international style, sometimes called the Bauhaus style. You may have heard of that. And so there's more Bauhaus buildings, international style buildings in Tel Aviv than anywhere else in the world. And there's huge architectural tours. It's really quite something. So there's that. There's a foreign country to those who are wandering around with their bags. These are the immigrants, I believe. And what is a Khamsin? A Khamsin is a heat wave. It's a hot, dry burst of air that comes in from the desert in the beginning of summer, end of spring. And then the speaker asks this question in the third paragraph: how could the small air, because it's a small city, it's a small place, how could it support so many recollections of childhood, withered loves, rooms grown empty? What are those recollections of childhood? They're somewhere else. They're recollections of the past, recollections of Europe, of loves that they weren't able to bring with them, that they broke up, and of rooms grown empty because they abandoned, they left behind their old life to come to this new world. And she says, like blackening snaps, and really that should be snapshots. I don't know why it's that way. They're blackening or blackening snapshots, camera snapshots. Their images are reversed, because of course images are reversed in the camera before they come out. On the negative, white winter nights across the sea. Rainy nights of summer. Capitals dark at dawn. Because there are no white nights in Israel because it does not snow and the moon does not glitter on the snow, creating what's called a white night in Russia. There are no rainy nights in summer in Tel Aviv. It never rains in the summer. What's the weather? Hot, dry, end of story. What's it like in the winter? Could rain, but never in the summer. And the capital's dark at dawn. Well, it's never dark at dawn because it's a much more temperate southern latitude than the European capitals.
Also, dark at dawn is never, it can't be a thing, can it? Dark at dawn.
That's true. Let's see what it says in Hebrew. Okay. לילות קיץ גשומים שמעבר לים ובוקרים אפלים של בירות. It doesn't say dark dawn. What it says is gray or hazy, foggy, darkened mornings of capitals. It doesn't say dawn. Thank you, man. And then, what does the speaker hear in the last stanza? Foreign footsteps. The marching songs of an army. What is that? But it's the sound of militarization, of nationalism, of armies on the march, of the Reich, of persecution in Europe. And what does she think she sees? The speaker. Ach tachzir et roshcha uvayam shata kisiat ircha. Your city's old church, your town's old church, floats upon the sea. So she imagines the white caps, I'm assuming, or the imaging of the white caps on the sea as the church. That's what she would have seen in Europe, the church of her town. But here, there is no church, because it's Tel Aviv, and it's the first Hebrew city. And what does she see but the sea, the Mediterranean? So her connection to the past is mixed with the present, a nostalgia, a melancholy. Yes, it's the new world, but she thinks back to the old world, fine, over there, as they say in Hebrew, Sham, there, Europe. There's a curious, did I tell you about this aspect of Hebrew literature? All these poems about the autumn? Did I tell you about this? There's many poems about the autumn in Israel, but for the most part, trees don't lose their leaves. What they're really writing about is the autumn of Europe.
What is autumn in Hebrew? Stav.
Stav, very nice.
Okay.
Random, but yes, correct.
I just wanted to make sure I remembered it. Felt like I did.
Is that someone you know?
Yes.
It's also a name. Like I said, it's these pagan names. Fall, autumn, spring is also one. Aviv. There's no winter. Winter or summer are not names in Hebrew, even though summer is a name in English.
So is autumn.
Autumn is a name. Spring
is winter.
Wait, who's named winter?
There's a lot named winter.
Yeah.
Somebody named winter.
Really? I've never heard of that.
It's a drag queen I've been
That's
called
awful.
unfortunately on the rise.
That's awful. I still have the number one baby name for like 10 years straight.
So I like this last one because it's purely personal. And this is very typical. These people are very typical of Goldberg, as the other two were very typical and famous ones by Greenberg. So I want to give you something typical, some sense of the poetry that is behind here, because we haven't done any poetry at all. And this text, because it's so much a part of this poetic world, I feel like it's fair to give it to you. And this one, from my mother's home, it's kind of a beautiful one. Sarah, would you read this one?
Yeah, sure. From my mother's home. My mother's mother died in the spring of her days, and her daughter did not remember her face. Her portrait engraved in my grandfather's heart was struck from the world of images after his death. Only her mirror remains, sunk deeper with age into its silver frame. And I, her pale granddaughter, who do not resemble her, peer into it today as if it were a pool hiding its treasures under the water. Deep, deep beyond my face, I see a young woman, pink-cheeked and smiling, a wig on her head. She is putting a long earring into the lobe of her ear, threading it through a tiny hole in the delicate flesh. Deep, deep beyond my face shines her eyes bright gold. The mirror carries on the family tradition that she was beautiful.
I think this is a really sort of beautiful poem, and it's very personal about her family, but about also a generation inheritance. It doesn't really connect to these larger themes of place or history, but it's nice. This is all that she has left in this. I'll read this one just because I think it sounds really nice. מבית אמי, מתה אמא של אמי באביב ימיה, וביתה לא זכרה את פניה. דיוקנה חרוט על ליבו של סבי נמחה מעולם הדמויות אחרי מותו. רק הראי שלה נשתייר בבית, העמיק מרוב שנים במשבצת הכסף, ואני נכדתה החיוורת שאינני דומה לה, מביטה היום אל תוכו כאל תוך אגם הטומן אוצרותיו מתחת למים. עמוק מאוד מאחורי פניי אני רואה אישה צעירה דרודת לחיים מחייכת, ופאה נחרית בראשה. היא עומדת עגיל מערך אל תנוך אוזנה, משליכתהו בנקב זעיר לבשר הענוג של האוזן. עמוק מאוד מאחורי פניי קורנת זהובית בהירה של עיניה, והראי ממשיך את מסורת המשפחה, שהיא הייתה יפה מאוד. It's also this nice sense that she herself accepts herself. There's like a beautiful essence here. Accepts herself, finds herself beautiful, recognizes the beauty in the past, connects it all through this image. It's a great lyric. Oh. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, it's a nice poem. And Leah Bluebird is become very, very popular in Israel. The last, she was always very popular, but she's had a renewed resurgence in the last 10 years or so. I think principally out of a sense of feminism to reclaim women writers who may have not gotten their due always, although she did. And there's been a whole host of work about her, books about her poetry, re-editions of her work in Hebrew. I know people who work on her work quite a bit, and she was an interesting, very interesting, and also a chain smoker, which is what ultimately killed her from lung cancer. What? R.I.P. Leah. So now you've read a little bit of the Hebrew. I'm not going to give you a break because whatever.
Thanks.
You don't need one. Because I want to push through this just a bit. I want to look at this issue of survivors here. If you need to get up, you can go, obviously, as Grace has done. Let's talk about the Washington. Take a look at 98. And I guess this survivors connects to the other one I discussed, the other issue C I discussed last time, which was annihilation or extinction. 98 in the middle, it says, I'll just read it to make it, well, I'll let you do it actually. Did you say where it says we annihilated the mammoths?
The top one.
Yeah. You see it?
No, I said Neanderthal.
No, above that. You see it, Sarah? You see it, Maddie?
I do.
You can read it, Maddie. Let's talk about annihilating the mammoths.
We annihilated the mammoths in America and the giant kangaroo in Australia, to pick just two from among hundreds and thousands of species, and the knowledge we amassed in so doing has been very successfully put into practice upon our own kind. We annihilated Neanderthal man, why not annihilate the Jews as well? I'll stop here, but the list goes on, and the court will be presented with this list in a thick binder accompanied by photographs. The Spaniards and the rest of the conquerors who arrived in America continued what the early Americans had started 10,000 years before them: annihilation of the locals, person, plant, and animal.
Fantastic. So we get a sense that annihilation, extinction, destruction is biologically driven. It's a kind of mechanism of endless repetition, a curse, a fate for human beings. And in the middle, of course, he sticks in the Jews to describe the destruction of the Holocaust. The Holocaust, as I said, you cannot overemphasize its presence. It always sneaks into places. It's always hiding in the background of Hebrew literature, at least post 1939, say. And it's present even here as well. Now, if you look at we get really the real discussion of survivors on 100, and I think this is an interesting bit of history. This is context about his grandfather lying on the beach in Netanya. Go ahead, sir. I saw you look up, so I assume you have it.
He would lie on the beach in Netanya for hours and would return red on one side and covered in sand on the other. They thought he enjoyed the hot sand, but no, he stayed there too long for mere enjoyment. He would listen closely, as it were, like a burglar. A few minutes before 5, he would get up and go to the lifeguard stand to read the names of Holocaust survivors. Every day at 5 in the afternoon, a worker would come with a broom, dumped in a clear glue, and stick the list onto the lifeguard stand.
Fantastic. So this is the beach, and this is where people hang out. So this is naturally where the news goes. What is it? It's a list of survivors. They get these lists from various displaced person camps, from Red Cross, from the Israeli government, from the German government, from the Polish government, from all kinds of places of lists of survivors. Because Israel in the 1950s, late 40s, 50s, was a traumatized country. It still remains to some extent. And people who had left in the 30s or earlier didn't know what happened to their relatives. They would receive a postcard and then nothing, a letter and then nothing. How did they find out in that era? Well, they put up these post bills with names. They broadcasted on the radio. So every day there was an update of names on the radio of who was a survivor, who had been located, where they were, and it would be broadcast. And this broadcast existed until not very long ago. I mean, it was less frequent, fewer names, but they would still have this. They would still have this mador chipus, like a program devoted to finding people who were missing. And sometimes people would still, decades would go by, they're still looking for people. They would still do this. And so this is an image of his grandfather looking for the survivors of his family, and he goes then, of course, this is when he goes to Europe, to Poland, finds out what happens, and then goes to Oritz Yergeber, the prophet, the seer of Hebrew literature, the composer of the dirges of the Holocaust. And that was that whole bit we read earlier. Take a look at 111. And this is his grandfather speaking, presumably to the narrator. And if you look at this bit, he says, this is after the page break, about 2/3 of the way down, he says, on the boat I met a man from the same city as me. And the grandfather says, I met a man from the same city as me, not shtetl, city. For you, all of Poland is shtetls. For you, Lublin is a shtetl, Warsaw shtetl, Krakow, a remote shtetl. Even Moscow is a shtetl. Only Tel Aviv is a city. Yes, a big city, metropolitan. Netanya, yes, too. Anyway, I met this Jew there. So what the grandfather is railing about is the obsessive self-regard, the navel-gazing of Israel and culture, and Tel Aviv as the center of the world, the center of the cultural world, the center of everything. And he's saying, everyone, for you, everything in Europe was a shtetl. And we discussed what a shtetl was. Remember that?
Small village in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, a village in Eastern Europe, a small town in Eastern Europe. That's very good, Grace. Fantastic. And this is not, he says, no, it's not. These are cities. Lublin, Warsaw, Moscow, Krakow. These are cities, not shtetls, but it's a kind of lack of geographic knowledge, a kind of lack of historical knowledge by the people, the Israelis that he meets. It says these are not shtetls. These are cities. These are cosmopolitan cities. Compared to Krakow and Warsaw and Lublin, Tel Aviv is a shtetl, is what he's saying. So when did I post that interview I did with Appelfeld? Did anyone read that interview with Appelfeld? I think I posted it.
I think you did. I think I read it, but it was a while ago, because it was like week 5.
Yeah, I think it's still up there. But anyway, so it's okay, you don't have to read. But I think I posted it, and Appelfeld, I think he's wrong, but he considers Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to be shtetls. He says that the Jews have brought with them from Europe, they've shtetlized, in a sense, the Israeli nation state. I don't think he's right, but of course, I never saw Shtetl. He did, so take that as you will, but I don't think that actually, demographically, geographically, that's correct. But I understand the point that he makes there. So there's something about that does not survive is a knowledge of this old world, a knowledge of what there was, and perhaps even its cosmopolitan elements. Last thing, 120. Let's read it from the top there. It's a bit long. Max, do you mind reading there where it says in a letter?
Sure.
Then take it slowly, okay?
In a letter bearing the stamp of the Red Cross and dated April 17th, 1940, it was only sent on the 29th of the month because it had to pass before the scrutinizing eye of the censor. The father of my grandfather reported in garbled German, "Please write very clear," is printed on the bottom of the letter in German, Polish, and French. Or, anyway, this is as much as I can decipher. Everyone is alive. Abram is at home. Jacob is in Tikocin on Pilsudski Street. Rivka Braun is near, say that again? Bialystok. Write him also to Aunt Tova in Chechnov, live free. The father of my grandfather, who fed the rhinoceros cabbage, who wrote these lines. A man rolls cabbage to an escaped rhinoceros, and 20 or 30 years later finds himself writing a letter that's like a last will. Not a thing remains of him other than the piece of air mail, an old family picture, and the cabbage he placed before the rhinoceros, an animal that rolled from Africa to a German zoo, and from there escaped eastward and was never caught. Like many living creatures, the father of my grandfather was annihilated by the super predator of his time.
Thank you. So see how, and so the father, that's the super predator of his time, was Hitler, the Nazis. So that's who annihilated the father of his grandfather, and I like the way he uses the father of my grandfather. He could have used another Hebrew word, but there's a kind of biblical genealogical essence there that I think we get also in English. The father of my grandfather sounds biblical and genealogical. And there's nothing left of it. This piece of airmail and this memory of the cabbage rolled to the rhinoceros, which sounds like a tall tale. And the cabbage comes from Africa to Germany and then escapes eastward to where? I don't buy it at all. But it's kind of like a magical scene. And we have dates, April 17th, 1940. We have an artifact, which is printed here. We see it, an image of it. And we also have these tall tales, so that mix in the mythology and the history mix, or we could say the memory and the history mix here. And then we have this biological metaphor. Again, this civilizational metaphor, this metaphor for extinction, or this sense of biological extinction, of drive for destruction. The father of my grandfather was annihilated by the super predator of his time. And that's, again, I think, something about this notion both of the way time is connected, the way human history is connected to natural history. I mean, we often talk about natural history as opposed to human history, but really what the author says here, the narrator says, is that human history is natural history. And he's considering it like that. Hitler as super predator, not as evil incarnate. Although, I understand both sides of those coins. Neither is accurate, but both are evocative, we should say. Well now, that's all I'm going to do for today. You have 5 minutes. You can go. 5 minutes early, so I can give you a break, but here I am. Go ahead. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Good. Bonnie? Yes.
Well, a lot of this is about creation of the